We're learning Basi Legani Tafshin Lamed Beis, which is the Maamar where the Rebbe explains the second ois of the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maamar, Basi Legani Tafshin Yud. The first time the Rebbe explained this was in Tafshin Yud Beis, and then in the second cycle again in Tafshin Lamed Beis. The Maamar Basi Legani Tafshin Lamed Beis begins with the general introduction from every Maamar Basi Legani, from the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maamar, that Iker Shechina B'Tachtenim Heisa, when Hashem created the world, the main presence of the Shechina was here in this world, and then there were Inyanim Bilti Ritzuyim that occurred starting from Chet Eitz Hadas, that caused that the Shechina was nistalic, it rose up level after level until afterwards Amdu Shiva Tzadikim, 7 Tzadikim came along, beginning from Avraham Avinu and concluding with Moshe Rabbeinu, who brought the Shechina back down here into this world. This occurred in time, primarily, on the day that the Mishkan was put up. That's when the Shechina was brought down here into this world in a practical way. And in the place where the Beis HaMikdash was, in the place where the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash was, that's where the Shechina was most palpable. And from there, it spread out to the whole entire world. In Ois Beis, the Rebbe continues along with the Maamar of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe explains that this Aveda was not only for the 7 Tzadikim, meaning Avraham Avinu, Yitzchak Avinu, etc., until Moshe Rabbeinu, but rather it's an Aveda which is necessary for every single Yid. As the Pasuk says, Va'amech kulam tzadikim. Every Yid has this Aveda, the Aveda of drawing the Shechina down here into this world, and every Yid has the ability, the koyach, to be able to bring the Shechina down here into this world. And the way that a Yid draws the Shechina down is in a way of V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham. B'seichai le'nemer ala b'seicham, that the Shechina is inside of them. And through being inside of every Yid, the Yid allows, just like with the Beis HaMikdash, that it spreads out from the Beis HaMikdash to the entire world, so too a Yid is a small Beis HaMikdash, and from each Yid it spreads out to the whole entire world. And this, that a Yid is able to accomplish this, is through the koyach of Moshe Rabbeinu. Just like it was through Matan Torah. Matan Torah was when Moshe Rabbeinu caused that the Shechina was brought down here into the world. Alekus was able to be brought down into the world, the Gzeira that separated Elyonim and Tachtenim, the spirituality and physicality was negated, and spirituality is able to now enter into this world. But now that it happened, that it occurred on Matan Torah, then through the koyach of Moshe Rabbeinu, we're able to learn the Torah and continue the mitzvahs and continue to bring down Shechina here into this world. But by Matan Torah, it was mitzad l'maylo, was something which occurred from above. However, the same is true also with the building of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. That's when mitzad, the mata from below the world, became a keli, a vessel that is able to contain the Shechina inside of it. And this gave the koyach, the ability, that afterwards every single Jew can continue this and build a Mishkan and draw down the Shechina into them, into themselves. In Eis Gimel, the Maamar continues and says that the reason why Iker Shechina B'Tachtenim Heisa is because Nis'ava Kadosh Baruch Hu Liyes Le'Yisbarach Dir B'Tachtenim. The Eibishter had a taiva that he should have a dwelling place B'Tachtenim here in this world. And this Nis'ava this taiva that the Eibishter had was that it should be accomplished. How should the Shechina come down here into this world? The Eibishter could do anything that he wants. But not that the Eibishter should make himself a dir b'tachtenim, but that we, people, should make a dira for Hashem through the Aveda of Iskafia Nesapcha. In other words, the taiva of the Eibishter had three aspects to it. First of all, the Eibishter wanted that there should be Gilui Elikos Lamata, that there should be revealed godliness below, in the Tachtenim. Second of all, the Eibishter wanted that this should be accomplished through the Aveda of man, of Adam, that means through the Aveda of Tachtenim. And third of all, the Aveda that the Eibishter wanted that Adam should use in order to accomplish this was the Aveda of Iskafia Nesapcha. That's an Aveda with inyanim of Tachtenim, with matters that are bitachtenim. All of these three are included in the taiva of the Eibishter. And that which we're able to draw down through our Aveda of Iskafia Neshapcha is the Iker Shechina, the primary presence of the Shechina. And this is that which it says in the Zayar that Kadiskafia Sitir Achra, when we do the Aveda of Iskafia, through this Istalik Yikara the Kudsha Berichu Bechulu Almin, we're able to cause that the Yikara, the presence of the Eibishter, is able to arise, is able to become more prominent in all of the worlds. What is the presence of Eibishter that becomes prominent, that becomes noticeable in all of the worlds equally? That's the Shebekulhu Almin B'Shava, that's equal in all of the worlds. That's not the HaMimali, because the HaMimali is very different in each world, but rather the HaSeviv, the which is higher than having any connection to the worlds. That's the Iker Shechina. And Eistalid, the Maamar continues. And here the Rebbe starts explaining and focusing specifically on the second ois of the Fidik Rebbe's Basi Legani. The Rebbe explains that in the Perek Sheni, in the second Perek of the Maamar, it says that the Aveda in the Beis HaMikdash was an Aveda of Iskafia Hamevia Lidei Ishapcha. Iskafia, that through this Iskafia, it causes that eventually there is Ishapcha. And the Maamar specifies that what is that? It's the Aveda of Karbanis. And the Rebbe explains that in the first chapter of the Fidik Rebbe's Maamar, it explains that the building of the Mishkan is an idea of drawing down Shechina below through Iskafia and Nesapcha. And in the Perek Beis, the Maamar says that even in the Mishkan itself, there is also an Aveda of Iskafia and Nesapcha, which continues to draw down the Shechina. And since it's something which is occurring after the Aveda of the building of the Mishkan, the Iskafia of the building of the Mishkan, it obviously is something which is higher. In Eishei, the Maamar continues and says that in the Fidik Rebbe's Maamar continues to explain the Aveda of Karbanis, and it says that the Aveda of Karbanis is a ruchniistic Aveda, it's a spiritual Aveda. Because the Hamshacha of Karbanis is through the Aveda of the Kayanim. And the Aveda of the Leviim, the Aveda of the Kayanim in the Aveda of the Karbanis themselves, and the Aveda of the Leviim, Bishiram Ubezimram, in the song that accompanied the Karban. And the Maamar says that this is the idea of Adam ki yakriv mikem karban lashem, that a person who brings from you, what's from you, that's the ruchniistic aved of karbanis, the behema that's inside of a person, the nefesh habahamis. Now, the truth is, the Maamar explains, the Rebbe explains, that even in the simple Aveda of Karbanis, you have the idea of ishapcha, because you're taking a physical animal and you're being makriv it on the Mizbeach, meaning you're taking something which is very dense and very physical and turning it over to a Karban Lashem. That's the ultimate expression of ishapcha. However, the Frierdiker Rebbe wants to emphasize in his Maamar that just like with the building of the Beis HaMikdash, first there's the building and the Aveda of building it, which draws down the Shechina through the Iskafia and the Ishapcha. And then there is the primary Aveda, which takes place inside of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash on a higher level, which is the Aveda of Karbanis, which is an Inyan of Iskaf and Ishapcha. So the Frierdiker Rebbe wants to teach us that the same is true also in the Mishkan that is inside of every Yid, the V'shachanti B'seicham, that after the Aveda of V'asuli Mikdash, the Mishkan that you build inside of yourself, you make of yourself into a Mishkan, then you have the Aveda of Adam Ki Yaakov Mikem, that through this we accomplish the main Aveda of V'shachanti B'seicham. In Eis Vav we continue. And the Rebbe says that in the beginning of the Maamar, in the first Eis of the Maamar, the emphasis is on the Aveda of Ishapcha. That the Aveda of Ishapcha is what draws down Iker Shechina B'tachtenim. Even though it speaks over there also about the Aveda of Iskafia, but it's speaking about Iskafia in its ultimate form, or as it reaches its ultimate form, which is the Aveda of Ishapcha, that the darkness is transformed into light. However, in Perek Beis of the Maamar, the emphasis is on the Aveda of Iskafia, the Aveda of Iskafia inside of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, the Aveda of Karbanis, which brings to Ishapcha. But the emphasis is not on the Ishapcha, which comes out, but the Iskafia, which is the Aveda which the person is doing. The Hamshacha inside of the Mishkan in Perek Beis of Iskafia is higher than the Hamshacha of Ishapcha in the building of the Mishkan. This is something which is counterintuitive. You'd expect Ishapcha to be higher than Iskafia. But in Perek Aleph, where it's speaking about the beginning of the Aveda, the building of the Mishkan, it speaks and emphasizes the Ishapcha, and then in Perek Beis, it emphasizes the Iskafia. And the Rebbe says that this is emphasized also more in the Aveda of Karbanis, which is in the heart of a person, in Avedas Ha'adam, rather than in the physical bringing of a carbon. Even though in the physical bringing of a carbon you also have Iskafia, but over there the primary emphasis, as we mentioned, is on the concept of Ishapcha, that you're taking a physical animal and turning it over, transforming it into a carbon Lashem. And the Aveda of Iskafia is emphasized much more in the person's carbon, in the Aveda inside of a person. When a person does Aveda, which is similar to Karbanis, the emphasis is not so much on the Ishapcha of it, as much as the Iskafia of it. What's the advantage of Iskafia over Ishapcha? So the Rebbe explains that in Iskafia, the person remains a metzias. He remains an existence. You're taking a physical animal, and you're not changing the physical animal. You're just making the physical animal, instead of being dense and heavy, to be holy and elevated. And by a person also, a person who accomplishes the Aveda V'Sabcha. What does it mean that he's accomplishing the Aveda V'Sabcha? It means that now this person, this identity, is now a tzaddik. He's someone holy, someone uplifted. So in ishapcha, the person or the thing that ishapcha is being accomplished with remains its own mitzias. What's iskafia? Iskafia is that you're bending, you're holding back the mitzias of the person himself. The ratzon of the person is for whatever it might be, and you're holding that back. That's bittul. That's leaving his mitzias. So the maila of the Aveda V'Skafia, the Rebbe explains, is that the Aveda V'Skafia brings a person outside of his mitzias, as opposed to the Aveda V'Sapcha, where a person remains in his mitzias. And if a person is leaving his mitzias, then he's also drawing down a greater hamshacha. He's drawing down hamshacha from the level of ayin hamiti, which is higher than mitzias, which is higher than existence. And this is, in general, the concept of karbanis, the aved of karbanis. The aved of karbanis is the idea of hala milmata l'mayla. You're being mevatel, the mitzias hatachtin, that which is below the yesh, and you're raising it up, and it's being nichlal inside of the ayin. That's Eis Vav of the Maamar. In Eis Zayin we continue, and the Maamar explains that this is related also to that which is explained in the beginning of the Maamar. That in the beginning of Basi Legani, the Frierdiker Rebbe explains that the beginning of all of the worlds, the beginning of creation, is the idea of dira b'tachteinim, of having this world become a dira for Hashem, for Iker Shechina. Now, the obvious question then is, why then did Hashem create the whole Seder Shtalshalos? Why didn't he just create Olam Hazeh Hatachten directly, immediately? If the whole purpose is that the Iker Shechina should be b'tachtenim, there should be the Eibishter and the Tachtenim. Why is there the whole long Seder Shtalshalos in between? Right? So the Maamar says that what's the purpose of everything in between? That since the Tachtenim are created from Elyonim, and through contemplation and reflection, the Tachtenim are able to appreciate that the chayos that they receive is from the Elyonim. This causes that in the Tachtenim there is this she'ifa, this desire, this yearning to go out of their mitzias and to become included in that which is higher. That's the accomplishment of bittul, and that's the purpose for which they were created. So therefore, the whole Seder Shtalshalos exists, so that the Tachtenim should have this desire of bittul. And this is a deeper explanation, the Rebbe says, in the idea of Yerida Tzorech Aliyah. Not the standard explanation that the purpose of the Yerida is for an Aliyah, but rather, the Yerida itself is Tzorech Aliyah, so that the Tachtenim should have an Aliyah into the levels which are higher than them, which were Yerid into them. In Eis Ches, the Maamar continues. And the Maamar quotes from Likutei Torah from the Alter Rebbe, that specifically by Karbanis, it says, Nachas ruach lefanei she'amarti v'naser itzaini, more so than by all other mitzvahs. The reason for this is, as Chazal say, with regard to the creation of the world, that Ad shelei nivra elam hayahu shmei levad, until the world was created, the Eibishter was alone with Shemoi, with his name. What's the level of Shemoi? That's the level of Malchus, which is the source of all creations. and before the world was created, Malchus was levad with Hashem. That means that Malchus wasn't a Mitzias on the bottom of Seder Hishtalshus, on the bottom of the 10 spheres. It was something which was kolul, which was included in the Eibishter. It didn't have a obvious Mitzias, an obvious presentation. And then, in order that the world should be created, in order that the Chaya should come from Ayin to Yesh, there was the Hispashtus of the Ar, and eventually the level of Malchus on the bottom of the 10 spheres. That through this Yerida, it's possible for the Yesh to then become Batal and Nichlal in Ein Sof Baruch Hu. And this happens primarily in the Aved of Karbanis. The Aved of Karbanis is the Hala Milmata Lemaila, as we've mentioned, and not just the Milmata Lemaila of the person who's doing the Aveda, but even in the higher levels of Seder Shtalshus and the Malachim above, which is the deeper idea of the song which takes place during the Aved of Karbanis, as the Magid explains on the Mishnah, Kol Bali Hashir, Yetzin Bashir, that Kol Bali Hashir is the Malachim, and Yetzin Bashir means that they leave their Kalim, they achieve a state of Bittul through the Shir, through the song of Karbanis. In a test, the Maamar continues, and the Maamar says that this is also the simple meaning of the word Karban. As the Baal Shem Tov explains, that the name of everything in Lashon HaKodesh indicates what its true Metzias is. What's a Karban? A Karban is from the language of Kirov, closeness, meaning that something is leaving its place and coming closer to something else. That's the Hala'a Mulmata Lemaila, as we've explained. The Bittul Milmata Lemaila, it's leaving its own Metzias and becoming kolul in Ein Sof Baruch Hu. And this is also that which is brought down, that the word lahakriv, to be makriv a karban, also has the same letters as the word laharkiv, which means to disintegrate, which is what occurs to a seed when this seed is inside of the earth, because that represents the ultimate bittul, which is what the hakrava of a karban is all about, to reach this level of laharkiv, to become completely batal, to become completely disintegrated like a seed in the earth. And this is also what takes place in karbanis by a person. The neshama comes down for the purpose that through coming down here into this world, it should be able to rise up, milmata lemaila, to leave its present existence and to become part of our Ein Sof Baruch Hu. And this aliyah takes place primarily at the time of davening, Tfilas Keneged Karbanis Tiknun. Like the Baal Shem Tov teaches, that at a time of davening, through the great kavana that a person has during davening, a neshama reaches a level of klois hanefesh, which is like the karban, which is burnt in the fire on the mizbeach, and it becomes kolul be'esh shel maila. And this, that a person is still alive after he finishes davening, the Baal Shem Tov says, is not a natural thing. It's something which is mitzad chaster shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because really, after davening, after Klais HaNefesh, a person shouldn't be alive anymore. And since the idea of davening is bittul, therefore, the preparation for davening is, like it says in the Mishnah, mitoich koived reish. What's koived reish? Also, the idea of hachna'a ubittul, of humility. But there's a difference between the bittul that takes place during davening, which is a result of the closeness of the neshama talikus, which causes the neshama to become batal. That's the klois hanefesh which we described, and the bittul which takes place before davening, the kavod reish, which is because of the distance that a person feels from godliness, which is the idea of the humility that a person feels, the achna and shiflos. And the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek explain in Maamarim that through the bittul and the hachna'ah and the shiflus that a person feels before davening, through this during davening, the person's able to fulfill that which Chazal say, that kol mashpil atzmai HaKadosh Baruch Hu magbiyah, that anyone who lowers himself, who humbles himself, the Eibishter lifts him up. That means before davening, you have the idea of laharkiv, of disintegration, of bittul b'mitzias, that you lose your existence. And through that, during davening, HaKadosh Baruch Hu magbiyah, the Eibishter lifts him up, which is the idea of the seed, which grows into an entirely new mitzias. That's explained in Eis Tes of the Maamar. Eis Yud of the Maamar continues and says that the reflection that brings this hachna'ah and shiflus, there are two types of reflection. One of them is explained in the Maamar of the Mittler Rebbe, who explains that it's through hisbeinenus becheshben toiv umeduktok ba'itzem pchisusei v'goydol v'chukai, through a careful, calculated reflection in how low a person is. The Tzemach Tzedek, however, adds in the Maamar of the Tzemach Tzedek that this calculation that a person makes is that why am I here? The Yerida is Tzeir Chaliyah, so that I should rise higher. And when a person reflects that he's not accomplishing the whole purpose of why the neshama came down, that will bring him to a feeling of shiftless, to a feeling of humility. And the Rebbe explains what's the difference between these two, the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. According to the beer of the Mittler Rebbe, the bittul that a person feels is in order that it's for he brings himself to a state of bittul. That means he recognizes not because that itself is an aveda of davening, but through bringing himself to that level of laharkiv, that causes that kol hamash HaKadosh Baruch Hu magbiyah, that then the Eibishter lifts him up. And this is the idea that a person reflects before davening, shiflus ha'adam. But the Tzemach Tzedek's reflection is a reflection which isn't for the purpose of davening, rather the reflection is an inyan of davening itself. The reflection is about how great the Eibishter is, how high the Eloi, where the Yerida began from, is, and how great the Aliyah needs to be, the Yerida Tzarech Aliyah, which is the hisbeinenus that a person has about Reimen Musakel, the greatness of the Eibishter. In Eis Yud Aleph, the Rebbe continues and says that the reflection, the hisbeinenus that a person has before davening of Reimen Musakel, the greatness of Eibishter, is about how distant I am from what I'm supposed to be accomplishing because of how great the Eibishter is. And that's what brings the person to this feeling of humility. And this is different than the hisbeinenus that a person has, the reflection that a person has of Reimen Musakel during davening. The Reimen Musakel that a person thinks about before davening brings a person that feeling of shiftless because he's so distant from accomplishing what he needs to accomplish. The hisbeinenus of Reimen Musakel that a person has during davening is in the Reimen Musakel itself. And this is the bittul which a person feels that brings him closer to the Eibishter. This was the end of Ois Yud. In Ois Yud Aleph, the Rebbe continues, and the Rebbe says that the bittul of davening is a bittul of klois hanefesh, like we said earlier from the Baal Shem Tov, is because the hisbeinenus is in the Ein Sof Shalamayla Mishaychus La'ilameis, like we said in the Reimus Hakel itself, a hisbeinenus in the idea of Havaya Echad, of the unity of Hashem. And the Rebbe Marash explains that Echad is the level that it says in Zayar and Tikunei Zer, which we say on Erev Shabbos before Mincha, Antu Chad. You, Eibishter, are one, v'loi b'chushban. In other words, there is a one which has a 2 and a 3 afterwards. But the one of Eibishter, the Echad of Eibishter, is an Echad that's v'loi b'chushban, that doesn't have any Echad attached to it. There is no relationship, there's no erech to Asheni and Ashlishi, which is different than in Seder Shtalshlus. The Echad in Seder Shtalshlus, the whole point of being an Echad in Seder Shtalshlus is that there's an erech to the Sheni and the Shlishi, even though the Echad is higher than the Sheni, but it has an erech, it has a connection to the Sheni. But the Eibishter's Echad is v'loi b'chushbam. And this reflection brings a person to a feeling of ava, of yearning for Hashem, as explained in the pasuk Mi li b'shamayim ve'imcha lechafatzti ba'aretz, that a person says, I don't want anything, not the eretz, not anything here in this world, and not even the shamayim, not even the ruchnistic things, Gan Eden and Olam Haba, mer nishtas dich alein, all I want is the Eibishter himself. And that's imcha loy chafatzti. What's the lashon of chafatzti? Chafatzti is different than ratzin. Ratzin is a chitzainistic level, and chayfetz is the pnimius of ratzin. Because chitzainis haratzin is something which is connected to the giluyim of Seder Hishtalshalos, because there are levels that they're emtsoyim, they're in the middle, that through them the world was created, nivra hayesh, milmayla lamata, and through this the yesh becomes nichlal, it becomes connected, it becomes completely one with the ayin milmata lamayla. So being that these levels are levels which connect me to Eibishter, I want those levels, I want Gan Eden, I want Olam Haba. But that ratzin that I have in these levels is only a chitzainistic ratzin. What's my chayfetz? What's my pnimis ratzin? Imcha loy chafatzti. I don't want anything but the Eibishter himself. The pnimis of a person's ratzin is the Ein Sof Atzmei, in the Eibishter himself. Then, in the last days of the Maamar, in Ois Yud Beis, the Rebbe brings down the Rebbe Maharash, that the Rebbe Maharash continues in the Maamar and explains, in the Rebbe Maharash's Maamar, and explains that the Ava of Mi Li Bashamayim, the love of Mi Li Bashamayim, that I only want the Eibishter, is primarily in the Nefesh Alikis. The Nefesh Bahamis doesn't only want the Eibishter, the Nefesh Bahamis is a Mitzias, and it wants itself. If you convince the Nefesh Bahamis that what's good for it is Gatlichkeit, it wants Gatlichkeit for itself. But it doesn't want Mi Li Bashamayim, ich will nicht dein Gan Eden, ich will nicht dein Olam Haba. But the Nefesh Alikis is able to have this feeling of Mi Li Bashamayim. However, the Rebbe Maharash says that nevertheless, through lengthy hisbeinenos, the Nefesh Bahamis also can agree to this. And this is this that after Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, it says V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. The Hashem Echad again is the Antuchad v'loi b'chushbon. Then it says V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha. What's b'chol levavcha? B'shnei yitzrecha. The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Nefesh Alikis and the Nefesh Habahamis. That through the lengthiest Beinanus and the Havaya Echad, even though it's the level of Chad v'loi b'chushbon, not taking into account all the Emtsayim, nevertheless, a person is able to bring himself to love the Eibishter in the level of Antuchad v'lei b'chushbon b'shnei yitzrecha, with the Nefesh Habahamis as well. As the Rebbe Rashab explains that when the Nefesh Alikis understands that Havaya Echad, that the Eibishter is one, this affects the Nefesh Habahamis, that the Nefesh Habahamis is at least forced to say Havaya Echad, even though the idea of Havaya Echad is not something that the Nefesh Habahamis, which is a Metzias and a Yesh, is capable of understanding. And the Rebbe Rashab adds that this excitement, the Rish Be'esh, that the Nefesh Alikis consumes the Nefesh Habahamis with, is because the Nefesh Habahamis is the garment of the Nefesh Alikis. The Nefesh Alikis clothes itself inside of the Nefesh Habahamis, and therefore its excitement consumes the Nefesh Habahamis together with it. And this draws down an additional level of Giloi, not just for the Nefesh Habahamis, but for the Nefesh Alikis as well. Similar to this which is explained in the Hemshech of Basi Legani, that through the Aveda V'skafya V'sapcha, this causes that we draw down the Ur Shebechulhu Almen B'Shaveh, as we mentioned earlier, and through Avedesenu, Masenu V'Avedesenu B'Meshech Zman HaGalus, this Hamshacha of Iker Shechina comes down even on a greater level than it was at the time when the Beis HaMikdash was standing. Just now it's concealed, and the Gilui, the revelation of it, will be Lasad Lavai with the coming of Mashiach.